Good morning, and welcome to the Financial Optimist. And today I'm asking the question, what is the best age to move out of your parents' house, and just how much is your pride worth to you? Well, to answer the first question, I'm going to show you some numbers and come to some conclusions. But to answer the second question, it's a bit more of a matter of an opinion. A good example is a few years ago when I was going through basic combat training with the Army, there was a man I was going through training with. He was about 22, 23. He told me the moment he turned 18, he moved out of his parents' house. He was very proud of it, and he said he's never moving back in. He's always going to maintain his own place no matter what it took. And I thought, okay, that's certainly a very masculine opinion to have. You know, you provide for yourself, have your own roof over your own head. That's great and all, but you have to think, is it really wise? And just how much money is your pride worth to you? That's only a question you can answer for yourself, but today let's look at some of the numbers, and we'll figure out, okay, what really is the wisest course of action moving forward. So, when we look at the number of young adults in the U.S. living with their parents, this chart goes back over 100 years. So we can see, back 100 years ago, it was almost half of young adults lived with their parents, and then during the Great Depression and World War II, in the 30s and 40s, it was up at almost half. And there's a lot of plays into that. Great Depression, obviously, we were a very poor country, and then returning vets from World War II weren't paying on a mortgage typically while they were gone, so they came back from the war, moved in with their parents in the 1940s, and then when the 1950s rolled around, they moved out, got their own place. That's why we see the numbers shrink dramatically. And so by about the 1960s here, it was down to less than 30% of young adults live with their parents. And this is when the boomers were starting to come of age. A lot of the boomers were born in the 40s, so by the time the 20s or the 60s rolled around, some of them were already in their 20s. And so for their generation, they always had very, very low numbers of young adults living with their parents under 30. And what's happened is over the decades, as life has gradually gotten a little more expensive, the younger generations, the Gen X, the Millennials, Gen Z, and in a few years, Gen Alpha, we realize most of them are going to be living with their parents for many years. And this chart ends in 2020, which showed 52% of young adults living with their parents. Now, mind you, that was because of COVID. The numbers have come down a little bit since then. But during the COVID pandemic, more young adults were living with their parents than back in World War II, which shows you just how expensive life has gotten. So let's go ahead and put an international comparison on this. So countries where parents living at home, and this is 15 to 29-year-olds. So this number is the young end does include high schoolers. Here in the U.S., you're not an adult till you're 18 years old, so that does skew the numbers slightly, but for international comparison, we see places like Italy, Greece, Spain, the Czech Republic, it's all far more than the United States. Even the U.S. is around two-thirds if you include teenagers in high school living with their parents. But you look at many of the countries having half or about half, many European nations live with their parents. And here, you know me, I'm Canadian, that's where I'm from, and so about a third of Canadians live with their parents as young adults. And so you look at that, you go, okay, it's very common in many countries for the majority, even the vast majority, live with their parents. In some places, even if it's not the majority, it's still a very sizable number. So move out of your parents' house as a young person, internationally speaking, is a very unusual thing to do. Even here in the U.S., it's the majority of young adults live with their parents. And so we have a strong cultural push to, push out the kids at a young age. And if you go back to here, it kind of makes sense for people who grew up in this time period to go, hey, it's easy to get a good job, easy to afford rent. There's no reason to stay here, you can afford it. But as life has gotten more expensive, the cultural norms have shifted. And for young adults in their 20s, living with their parents is a very normal thing to have. No one really thinks much about it anymore. It's only the older generations that seem to care about it. You go to other countries, and they go, okay, yeah, it's totally normal to live with your parents. And so you think, all right, in other countries it's normal. The younger generation is normal. The only people that don't find it normal are the older generations of Americans. Everyone else pretty much on the planet finds it normal. So let's start to look at it during the pandemic, what that did. So in 2019, for the 18 to 24-year-old age bracket, it was more than 50% live with their parents, but during the peak of the pandemic, it was over 67% live with their parents. So when economic times get rough, a lot of Americans move back with their parents, and once the pandemic is over, they move back out again. And that's ultimately considered the biggest safety net. You move on your own, if all else fails, you can always move back in. And even in the 25 to 29-year-olds, it was only up to around 26% moving with their parents. But, you have to think about it, like, okay, when you're 25, you're making more money than when you're 18. And, that's a sizable number of young adults. So again, living with their parents under 25 is perfectly normal. Even over 25 is still pretty common. And you have to ask, okay, why are so many people, living with their parents here? Well, if you look at the numbers, the rent in the United States is quite high. Places like California, $2,500, New York, Massachusetts, almost $3,000 per month for rent on an apartment. And here in Florida, where I live, it's around $2,000 a month rent. So you think, okay, if you're dropping $2,000 a month on a one-bedroom apartment, that's $24,000 a year. But how much do you make? Well, when it comes to income by age, for young people under 20 making 30-some thousand a year, so moving out on your own, if you were to pay $24,000 a year on an apartment, that would eat up almost your entire paycheck. And mind you, this is the before tax income. So after taxes, it would take almost everything. Even 20, 24-year-olds, you're making $41,000 a year. Rent is well north of 50% of your paycheck, so you just can't afford to move out at that point. It's when you're in that 25 to 34-year-old age bracket, that's when you're making, 50, almost 60K a year. That's when people can actually afford to move out. So that starts to explain, when it comes to moving out by age, is people over 25 can't afford to move out, people under 25 can't afford to move out. And so that typically, is how it is in the United States. Many other countries, it can be quite similar to that as well. And we look at this chart here, you can see for under 25-year-olds, back in 2005 was around 52% living with their parents. Now it's 57%. It did peak at around 60% during the pandemic here, according to this chart. And the older you get, 25, 29, 30, 34, the numbers do drop off a bit, but you generally see the numbers are going up over time. So, as the years go on, more and more people are either moving back in with their parents or they just aren't moving out in the first place. So like I said, as life gets more expensive, as the wages continue to stagnate, living with their parents is just going to be the new normal moving forward. And when you break it down by college, this actually makes me very optimistic. People going to full-time college, 2/3 of them were living with their parents back then, 2/3 of them now. And because you look at the cost of college, the majority of the expenses is the room and board, not the tuition. So if you go to college or live with your parents, you can cut the school and college down to a fraction of what it would otherwise be. But if you move out on your own, you go out of state, you live on your own, pay full room and board, university is way too expensive. And even part-time college students went from 46% to 63%, so that's a pretty big jump. Even not in school, we see it's going up as well. So across all demographics, and age groups, more people living home with their parents for longer years is becoming the norm. So what's the best strategy moving forward? I say if you're a young person under 25, you really shouldn't even plan to move out until you're at least 25. Because looking at the wages for the age range, looking at the kind of rent you got to be paying, places like Oklahoma is pretty cheap. But I think if you're under 25, just don't even plan to move out. Just say, hey, from 18 to 25, work a job. Don't bother going to college because college is pretty overpriced these days. If you get a full-time job, working at a factory, working at a warehouse, getting $20 an hour, if you're from 18 to 25, you could save well north of $100,000, maybe $200,000 even by the time you're 25 years old. And then you could afford to move out. Because that kind of money saved up, you could buy a house in some places for $100,000. This house behind me, I paid $100,000 for this house. It's a 3-bedroom house. And, even other places, like I said here in Oklahoma, $1,000 a month for rent. Arkansas, about $1,100 a month. If you want to move out of your parents' house, say you're living in New York, paying, you would be paying $3,000 a month rent on an apartment. What you could do is you could live home with your parents and save some money. And then when you move out, you can move out to some place that's a bit cheaper, like this. Either buy a house, rent a house. I live here in Florida. I paid $100,000 for a 3-bedroom house, so you can find affordable real estate even in the states that are not the cheapest states. And once you do that, you live rent-free the rest of your life. So here, I decided my strategy to go through life was I was going to go through college, live with my parents. I did. I graduated debt-free, paid cash for both my degrees, and it was because I lived with my parents. That's what helped me to do that. And when it comes to buying a house, I bought a house here in Florida because I was living with my parents while I saved up the money, and then I paid cash for the house. Now I have a house of my own, so I'm completely debt-free, never borrowed a penny my entire life, and that enables me to keep my bills very, very low. So I'm making some great money. My bills are almost nothing, and I'm putting 80 to 90% of the paycheck into savings every month. And that's how I'm able to be successful, is I decided, since most people are doing it anyways, just live with the parents for a few more years in your 20s. Don't move out as soon as you can. Once you can afford to move out, live with mom and dad for a couple extra years, save the money, pay cash for a house, and then once you own your house free and clear, you never have to move again. You're financially stable. You can afford to save for retirement. You can afford a family. You can afford anything you want. Once you have a house you own free and clear, you really, can't survive on a very small income. Like me, I could get a part-time minimum wage job and still live paycheck to paycheck, or get myself a full-time job, make great money, and be saving for an early retirement. I have lots of options because I decided living home with my parents for just a couple of extra years in my 20s really did set me up for a massive amount of success. That way, I'm not paying these kind of rental prices because I already own a house. And that's the strategy I promote here at the Financial Optimist is just live with your parents in your 20s, save the money, don't move out until after you can afford to pay cash for a house. And that right there is truly the best path moving forward. If you're a young person that wants to be successful and prosperous, that's how you do it. If you have any questions, drop them below in the comment section. I'd love to answer them. Otherwise, have a great day, and I'll see you next time.